My lords and members of the House of Commons, by virtue of His Majesty's commission, under the Great Seal, to us and other lords directed, and now read, we do, in His Majesty's name, and in obedience to His Majesty's commands, prorogue this Parliament to Tuesday, the 3rd day of July, 1945, to be then here holden.
The 1945 general election took place after the war in Europe was at an end, but whilst the Allies were still at war with Japan. It had been 10 years since the previous election, the longest gap between elections in modern times, and it would be the first election at which the Labour Party would win a majority, sweeping Clement Attlee to power in a landslide. At the time, many people had expected that the Conservative Party, led by Winston Churchill, would win the election. After all, Churchill had led the country through the war, and his popularity had remained astonishingly high throughout, with Gallup polling showing that over 80% of the people approved of his leadership throughout the war, up to and including the month of the general election. Meanwhile, the leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, was poorly regarded by contemporaries, with Winston Churchill famously describing him as a, quote, modest man with much to be modest about, and quipping that, quote, an empty taxicab pulled up and outstepped Clement Attlee. And it wasn't just his political enemies that underrated Attlee. When Clement Attlee was elected leader of the Labour Party in 1935, Hugh Dalton, who was to go on to be Chancellor of the Exchequer under Attlee, commented in his diary, "A little mouse shall lead the party," and in February 1940, when Beatrice Webb went to hear him speak, she wrote in her diary that, quote, he looked and spoke like an insignificant elderly clerk, without distinction in his voice, manner, or substance of his discourse. To realise that this little non-entity is the parliamentary leader of the Labour Party, and presumably the future Prime Minister, is humiliating. And further to this, in October 1940, when Cecil King of the Daily Mirror encountered him for the first time, he wrote that, quote, Attlee is a man, I should say, of very limited intelligence and no personality. If one heard he was getting £6 a week in the service of the East Ham Corporation, one would be surprised he was earning so much. And on the eve of the election, Harold Lasky, who was chairman of the Labour Party, wrote to Attlee to advise him to resign on the grounds that, quote, the continuance of your leadership is a grave handicap to our hopes of victory in the coming election, so I suggest you owe it to the party to make a change on the eve of this our greatest of battles. Now to this, Attlee famously replied, quote, Dear Lasky, thank you for your letter, the contents of which have been noted. So the overwhelming narrative going into the election was clear. This was Churchill's election to lose. And it's easy to understand why. Churchill had led the country through its darkest hour and had seen the country through to victory in Europe. Surely, many commentators thought, the country would show its gratitude to Mr. Churchill and re-elect him to be Prime Minister. In this election newsreel, which would have been shown in cinemas up and down the country, we heard Churchill remind the country of his promise to give nothing but blood, toil, tears and sweat, and he argues that he is the man to build a sane and just peace. Let's hear directly from Winston Churchill from this broadcast aired during the 1945 campaign.
5 years ago, I promised you blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And your untiring response brought us, in the end, victory over Germany. Today, we still have tears. Not so many, thank God. But the conquest of Japan, hand in hand with our American allies, is a formidable undertaking which we must and will see through to the end. And we must still look forward, alas, to blood and sweat. We have a terrific task ahead of us. We have a shattered world around us, and we must help to rebuild it. We must strive for a sane and just peace which will save us all and our children from the constant fear of war. Our trade and industry must be restored to a sound peacetime footing so as to ensure steady employment for all. We must strive to give everybody greater security against poverty, unemployment, sickness, and old age. Above all, we must tackle the housing problem with the same drive which we put into our war effort.
Meanwhile, Attlee's address to the nation, whilst acknowledging Churchill's contribution to the war, he makes the argument that this election is about winning the peace for the people. Let's hear from Clement Attlee.
The Parliament of 1935 had a big Conservative majority, and the policy pursued by the Conservative government landed this country into war. It was due to the action of the Labour Party that this Conservative government resigned. Mr. Churchill, who had opposed his own party, formed an all-party government which successfully brought us to victory. Now a new Parliament must be elected. The choice is between that same Conservative Party, which stands for private enterprise, private profit, and private interests, and the Labour Party, which demands that in peace as in war, the interests of the whole people should come before those of a section. Labour puts first things first: security from war, food, houses, clothing, employment, leisure and social security for all must come before the claims of the few for more rent, interest and profit. We have shown that we can organise the resources of the country to win the war. We can do the same in peace.
What I think you can see from these two clips is the contrast in tone from the two leaders. Churchill is keen to emphasise that the war is not over yet, and so he argues that there are still hard times ahead, whereas Attlee focuses on winning the peace. He argues that Labour would rebuild Britain by putting, quote, first things first, and on his list are security from war, food, houses, clothing, employment, leisure and social security for all. Therefore, one explanation for Labour's victory in 1945 is that they focused on what was needed to win the peace, which serves to emphasise how, whilst many people admired Churchill's wartime rhetoric and leadership, they just didn't trust the Conservative Party with following through on their peacetime priorities. For example, during the war, in November 1942, William Beveridge had published a report that is now universally known as the Beveridge Report. This report recommended that the next government set up a comprehensive system of cradle-to-grave universal social security benefits to slay what Beveridge called the 5 giants of idleness, ignorance, disease, squalor and want. This report, which became a bestseller, was taken up enthusiastically by the Labour Party, who people trusted to implement these changes in office, so that there would be no return to the poverty and destitution which had led to hunger marches in the 1920s and 1930s. The Labour Manifesto was a short but radical document, which promised full employment, nationalisation of industry, the creation of a national health service, a system of social security, the raising of the school leaving age to 16, and mass house building. Indeed, what is striking about it to a modern reader is just how blunt it is about the aims and objectives of that first Labour government. For example, it stated, quote, "The Labour Party is a socialist party and proud of it. Its ultimate purpose, at home, is the establishment of the Socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, free, democratic, efficient, progressive, public-spirited, its material resources organised in the service of the British people." And it framed the choice facing the British people in 1945 in the following terms, quote, "The effective choice of the people in this election will be between the Conservative Party, standing for the protection of the rights of private economic interest, and the Labour Party, allied with the great trade union and cooperative movements, standing for the wise organisation and use of the economic assets of the nation for the public good. These are the two main parties, and here is the fundamental issue which has to be settled. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party also committed itself to a house-building programme, a scheme of national insurance, and a comprehensive health service covering the whole range of medical treatments, from the general practitioner to the specialist. Their argument was that the country needed to come together after the war, rather than being divided by factional interests. In their manifesto, this was articulated as follows, quote, "We seek the good of the whole nation, not that of one section or one faction. We believe in the living unity of the British people, which transcends class or party differences. It was this living unity which enabled us to stand like a rock against Germany when she overran Europe. Upon our power to retain unity, the future of this country and of the whole world largely depends." But infamously during the campaign, Churchill allowed himself to go much further, saying the following in what would be remembered as his Gestapo speech. "No socialist government, conducting the entire life and industry of the country, could afford to allow free, sharp, or violently worded expression of public discontent. They would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, no doubt very humanely directed in the first instance. And this would nip opinion in the bud. It would stop criticism as it reared its head, and it would gather all the power to the Supreme Party and the party leaders, rising like stately pinnacles above their vast bureaucracies of civil servants, no longer servants and no longer civil. And where would the ordinary simple folk, the common people as they like to call them in America, where would they be once this mighty organism had got them in its grip?" This extreme rhetoric might have had some impact in different circumstances, but the problem for Churchill is that Labour ministers had been in power alongside him during the war, with many of them filling key domestic positions in the cabinet. Furthermore, the country had seen that during the war, it was possible for the resources of society to be directed towards one end, and so it might have seemed reasonable to them for the state to do the same in peacetime. In the end, the result was a Labour landslide, which brought the Labour Party to power with a majority of 145 seats, a result which shocked contemporary commentators. But it really shouldn't have. Opinion polling was a very new thing at this point in time, with Gallup polling only starting in the UK in 1943. But every single poll that Gallup did showed that Labour was ahead between 1943 and 1945. And the reason Labour won in 1945 is that this was an election that wasn't about Churchill's wartime record, which people respected. It was about who people trusted to transform the country in peacetime. And this was Attlee and the Labour Party, who had grasped that people wanted fundamental change in 1945 and no return to the poverty of the interwar years, and they trusted Labour to deliver this. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And if you've enjoyed this video, there are lots more like it. I've made videos about lots of elections and prime ministers and all sorts of other things. But anyway, for now, goodbye and best wishes.